ladies and gents, we are starting a different bit of the Africa module today. So as ever, I'm going to remind you of where this fits into page 12. Page 12 is a really good sort of point to come back to because it reminds you of where everything fits in together. We have completed 4 possible physical geography reasons as to why the sub-Saharan Africa might be struggling with its development. We've completed those and we are starting on the economic section. So today we're going to talk about trade, all right, trade in Africa, which is the first box of the economic column, and it starts on page 25 of your module booklets. Right. So let's just start off with a little reminder of what trade is. The irony, look, of a supermarket where it's fully stocked and no one's panic buying. Oh, they were the days. Anyway, I digress. Trade is a tried and tested way to make money. Now this is obviously that the photograph that you can see there is people trading at a very personal level, but it's also something that countries are able to do. So we talked last week about resources. Sorry if I've gone a bit distant, I'm just shutting the door. And you could maybe have some diamonds like Botswana and Sierra Leone, and you could sell those diamonds to make money and therefore develop. So trade is a really effective way of making money, and that money could potentially be used to develop your country. But if I could just emphasise this stage once again, it's all well and good making money, but you need a government who invest that in the kinds of things that are going to improve people's quality of life. You've got some countries in the world who make money and they keep the wealth and have lovely cars and palaces and all sorts of things. They don't do this. This is the really important stage, and we'll be looking at that in future videos when we talk about governance and corruption and stuff like that. Okay, so that's a really important thing. Yes, make money, but do the right things with it. But the other thing, bit of a reminder from year 1, the other brilliant thing about trade is you can get what's called a multiplier effect. This is a version of it. You know it better actually in its reverse version, which is the negative multiplier effect or the spiral of decline. And we talked about that in year 1. When you get deindustrialisation, which is the decline of your secondary sector, you get job losses and everything in an area starts to go wrong. Well, this is the reverse. This is where you get more jobs and everything gets better and better and better. Okay, so trading makes you money, it leads to the multiplier effect, it can potentially be brilliant. Turn over to page 26. But there are problems. There's always problems. This is geography. We have to find something negative to talk about. So you need to have something to sell, something to trade. And that partly depends on your physical geography, your exclusive economic zone, whether you've been geologically lucky. I'm not going to go back over all of that. So step number 1, you need something to sell. Step number 2, you need ideally to be able to get that out of the ground, out of the sea, get your hands on it yourself, because if you don't have the money or the expertise or the technology or whatever, you're going to have to ask somebody else to help you. And you know the way the world works, ladies and gents. Generally speaking, if you then ask somebody to help you, they are going to take some of the profit. And if they feel that you're a less developed country who could possibly be bullied and exploited, they might even take most of the money. But we're going to talk about that more when we get to multinational companies in other videos. Let's assume you've got something to sell. Let's assume, however you've managed to do it, you can get it out of the ground. You then need to be able to actually trade it. If you're landlocked, because 90% of trade is done by ship, if you're landlocked, that's really hard. And Burkina Faso is a really good example for you of a landlocked country and the problems it has. So we've kind of talked about the first three. We're going to talk more about the second one in other videos. Today I want to talk to you mostly about the obstacles, okay? Now if you do economics, probably business, these will be quite familiar to you. Page 26 is really, really useful for this. Okay. So starting point, as you can see, Africa is not trading massively in commercial services or in merchandise. So there's something happening, and it's the four factors we've talked about. But the one that gives you the most to talk about is the fourth one. And the first thing I want to explain to you is a tariff. So tariff is defined on page 26. I'm using a really very simple example here. Let's say take two identical computers, same processing speed, screen size, graphics card, memory, everything about them is identical. The British one costs more to manufacture because wages are more expensive, electricity is pricier, the rent is higher, yada yada yada. Making things in the UK is more expensive. So, even if you include your profit margin, and by the way, I've completely made up how much it costs to make a PC. I have no idea. Even if you include a profit margin, the Chinese one, if I was a consumer looking to buy a computer, I'm obviously going to choose the Chinese computer because it's the same specification and it's going to cost me much less money. Right. If you allow that to happen, what would eventually happen after a few months, maybe, is the British company is going to go bust because they cannot compete with the Chinese company. All right. So what we can do is we can do something called protectionism, which is something that governments do to protect their own companies. And they do it by adding something called a tariff. Now, to you and me, a tariff is a lump of money. It's another form of tax, actually. And we have all sorts of tariffs. Now, I've just randomly gone through this website. So if you want to be nosy and have a look at that website, by all means, have your own search. So, for example, look, if you wanted to import smoked salmon, you would have to pay a tariff of 13%. If you wanted to import bituminous oil shale, no tariff. If you wanted to import a grand piano, 4% tariff, you get the idea. There are tariffs for all sorts of things. And there's a very simple way of finding out. If it's something that the UK doesn't make itself, we will not really add much for tariff because we want to import it. If we make it in Britain and we want to protect our own companies, we will add a massive tariff. Okay, so tariffs are lumps of money added onto imports. And what it does is it protects the company. All right? So, in fact, I'll come back to that. The thing about protectionism is it's fantastic for the company being protected and fantastic for the country. It's really not great for the others because it means, if we go back to my little PC example, protecting this British company, great for Britain. If you protect the British company, the Chinese company doesn't sell as many computers and then they don't make as much money and they can't develop. So do you see, it's good for one and not good for the other. And the problem for sub-Saharan Africa is if rich, powerful companies if rich, powerful countries keep protecting their own companies, it's really hard for you to develop because the trading rules are not fair. Okay, that's the fundamental point that we're trying to make, that they're not fair at all. And then what you can then have are what called trade blocs. Now, if you were in a trade bloc, and I'm sorry to mention the EU, but it's the one that we sort of know the most about. In the EU, we had an agreement, they still have an agreement, that you don't add tariffs to anyone else's products. So you could import something from France or Spain or Germany, no tariffs whatsoever. It's kind of a trade agreement, and that's what a trade bloc is. Mexico, the USA and Canada are part of a trade bloc. They do not protect each other, protect themselves against each other. They don't add tariffs, okay? So trade blocs, again, are brilliant for the people in that trade bloc, but they're not very good for anyone who's trying to sell stuff. And of course, if you are in sub-Saharan Africa, the people you want to sell to, by and large, are the people who live in the more developed countries, because they're the people with the money. So it sort of makes perfect sense. But because they're in their own trade blocs, it's really, really hard to access those markets. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So if we just come back to that 4-part list, it's quite hard to trade. It sounds like a really simple thing, but actually you've got to have so many things in place that it just makes it really, really challenging. So at the bottom of page 26, you've got an example about coffee, and here I'm going to show you an example about flowers. What I'm trying to get across with those photographs is about adding value. If you sell grain, it's not worth a huge amount of money. If you sell bread, it's worth a lot more. If you sell milk, it's not worth much. If you turn it into cheese, it's worth more money. So what would be fantastic for the countries of sub-Saharan Africa is to be able to add value to their products, so they're not selling the raw unprocessed form, they're selling a ready-made product because they can charge us more money. Well, if you have a look at the example at the bottom of page 26, it will make you angry probably. Germany makes more money from coffee than Africa does, but they don't grow any coffee. And that's because raw, unprocessed coffee beans, no tariff at all. Processed coffee, massive tariff. So what the EU countries do is they buy up all of the low-value raw coffee beans from Africa, don't pay them very much, do all of the roasting, grinding, production of coffee in the European countries, get most of the profit margin. The trade rules are not fair to less developed countries, all right? And I just want to show you this. Obviously, you can open this hyperlink at your leisure. This is just horrible, really. This is from 2015. Developing countries have a gun pointed at their chest. Either they sign or their market access to the EU is restricted. In this case, the gun was pointed at Kenya, more specifically its cut flowers industry. The flower business is a lucrative one, and Kenya is one of the world's largest exporters of cut stems, so they're using flowers to trade. It was a crushing blow when Europe imposed tariffs on Kenya's cut flowers in October, potentially making their blooms more expensive than those grown on European soil. Rather than risk losing trade, Kenyan flower companies absorbed the duties, and it cost them up to about £2 million. Here's the bit that makes me angry. Kenya was being punished for failing to sign a new trade agreement. So what we do in the rich, powerful countries is we use tariffs, protectionism, as a weapon. And if you don't do what we want you to do, we will change the trade rules. And what I'm trying to get across to you is, it's really hard. You've got to have something to sell. You've got to be able to get it out of the ground. You've got to be able to get to a ship. You've got to have a coastline. And then you've got all of this ridiculous politics to get past as well. Trade is theoretically a brilliant way to develop if you are able to do it. But my gosh, do we make it tricky for less developed countries. So that's just a bit of a flavour. We're going to pick up on that more by talking about multinational companies and all sorts. This next theme is all economics, and you'll find it will all kind of begin to link together, and we'll also, of course, try to have a summative look at the end. Thanks, folks.